Today, Live March 17, 2021. Live World News Headlines. U.S. Blinken blasts aggressive China, Austin stresses South Korea alliance to counter North Korea. U.S.'s Austin says South Korea alliance important due to China, North Korea concerns. Yonhap. Russia calls U.S. allegations over Putin-directed election meddling baseless. Analysis: Biden team's China focus put South Korea on the spot ahead of talks. Top U.S., Japan officials say China's behavior inconsistent with international order. China lodges stern representations with U.S., Japan over joint statement. Bolstered by allies. Biden officials take blunt message to first China talks. Taiwan bolsters South China Sea deployments, gets U.S. submarine parts approval. UK lawmakers call for blacklist of firms linked to Uyghur abuses. Pfizer to halt biosimilar output in China, sell assets to Wu Zai Biologics. Russia says British nuclear plans deal serious blow to arms control, RIA. U.S. Blinken blasts aggressive China, Austin stresses South Korea alliance to counter North Korea. Tokyo Seoul, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Wednesday China was acting aggressively and repressively. And Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin called for a stronger alliance with South Korea to better address security concerns over China and North Korea. Speaking to a roundtable of Japanese journalists in Tokyo, Blinken said Beijing was raising tensions, not diminishing them. Citing its posturing over Taiwan and actions in the East and South China Seas where it has territorial disputes with Japan and other Asian nations. Blinken is visiting Japan and South Korea along with Austin in a bid to fortify Washington's alliances in Asia, in a first overseas trip by top-level members of President Joe Biden's administration. China's extensive territorial claims in the East and South China Seas have become a priority issue in an increasingly testy Sino-US relationship and are an important security concern for Japan. Blinken said Beijing was acting both more repressively at home and more aggressively abroad, including in the East China Sea, including with regard to the Senkakus, as well the South China Sea and also with regard to Taiwan. The Senkakus, also referred to as Diaoyu in China, are islets in the East China Sea controlled by Japan but claimed by China. Japan has real interest in what happens with regard to Taiwan and Taiwan Straits, and we spent some time comparing notes on that, said Blinken, describing talks he had with Japanese officials on Tuesday. The comments echoed statements issued by Blinken, Austin and their Japanese counterparts after 2+2 talks in Tokyo and come ahead of Blinken's first in-person meetings with Chinese counterparts planned for later this week in Alaska. We look forward to the opportunity to lay out in very clear terms to our Chinese counterparts some of the concerns that we have about the actions they're taking, said Blinken. After arriving in Seoul, Austin highlighted the significance of the United States alliance with South Korea in responding to growing security concerns over China and North Korea. The U.S.-South Korea alliance is ever more important because of the unprecedented threats from China and North Korea. Austin said at the start of talks with South Korean Defense Minister Soo Wook, according to the Yonhap news agency. Austin called the alliance a linchpin for peace, security and prosperity in Northeast Asia, and for a free and open Indo-Pacific region and beyond. Soo said it was important for the allies to maintain a strong deterrence and joint defense posture against North Korea, and vowed to strengthen the alliance, Yonhap said. Austin and Blinken were set to hold 2+2 talks with their South Korean counterparts and meet President Moon Jae-in and other senior officials until Thursday. U.S.'s Austin says South Korea alliance important due to China, North Korea concerns, Yonhap. Seoul, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said on Wednesday the United States alliance with South Korea is ever more important because of growing security concerns over China and North Korea, the South's Yonhap news agency reported. South Korean Defense Minister Soo Wook said it was important for the allies to maintain a strong deterrence and joint defense posture against North Korea, the agency added. Russia calls U.S. allegations over Putin-directed election meddling baseless. Moscow, Russia on Wednesday described U.S. intelligence allegations that President Vladimir Putin had likely directed efforts to try to swing the 2020 U.S. presidential election to Donald Trump as baseless. A 15-page American intelligence report, released on Tuesday, added heft to long-standing allegations that some of Trump's top lieutenants were playing into Moscow's hands. By amplifying claims made against then-candidate Joe Biden by Russian-linked Ukrainian figures in the run-up to the November 3 election. The document prepared by the U.S. intelligence community is another set of baseless accusations against our country for interfering in American domestic political processes, Russia's embassy in the United States said in a statement on Facebook. The conclusions of the report on Russia conducting influence operations in America are confirmed solely by the confidence of the intelligence services of their self-righteousness. No facts or specific evidence of such claims were provided. Washington is expected to impose sanctions on Moscow as soon as next week because of the allegations, three sources said on Tuesday on condition of anonymity. Those sanctions could also address the cyber hack blamed on Russia that used U.S. company SolarWinds Corp to penetrate U.S. government networks. Russia has denied any involvement in that hack. The United States imposed sanctions on 4 senior Russian officials earlier this month over Moscow's treatment of opposition politician Alexei Navalny, something Moscow cast as unacceptable meddling in its domestic affairs. Russia's U.S. Embassy in Washington on Wednesday accused the United States of seeking to besmirch Russia's image and of blaming others for its own problems. We state that Washington continues to practice megaphone diplomacy, with the main goal to maintain a negative image of Russia. To blame external players for destabilizing the situation inside the country, the embassy said in the same statement. This attitude of the administration hardly corresponds to our proposed equal and mutually respectful expert dialogue in search of solutions to the most pressing issues. Washington's actions do not lead to the normalization of bilateral relations. Analysis: Biden team's China focus put South Korea on the spot ahead of talks. Seoul: for the first time in years there are liberal presidents in South Korea and the United States, but the change in U.S. administrations hasn't made it any easier for Seoul to balance its alliance with Washington and its economic reliance on China. China has dominated the agenda of an Asia tour by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who arrive in South Korea on Wednesday for talks, casting its shadow even over core issues like the North Korea nuclear threat and strengthening the alliance. The Americans' message has focused on marshalling their Asian alliances to counter potential coercion and aggression by Beijing. That represents a challenge for Seoul, which is not eager to provoke China, its largest economic partner. President Moon Jae-in also needs the backing of both U.S. President Joe Biden and the Chinese to have any hope of achieving a breakthrough with Pyongyang in his final year in office. There's a paradox where the liberal governments in Seoul and Washington agree on issues like climate change, public health, and equality, but have disagreements over bilateral relationships with places like China, North Korea, and even U.S. ally Japan, said John Delury, a China expert at South Korea's Yonsei University. When you frame the U.S.-South Korea relationship in terms of those countries, then there is a lot of disagreement and it's hard to find common ground. Delury said. So the emphasis on those issues in some of the messaging is not really finding common ground, but rather highlighting differences. National interests. South Korea paid a steep economic price after it angered China in 2017 by deploying a U.S. Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense (THAAD) anti-missile system that features radar which Beijing believes could be used to penetrate its territory. The economic fallout cost South Korea $7.5 billion in lost income in 2017 alone, according to estimates by the Hyundai Research Institute. While the Bank of Korea estimated that it knocked 0.4 percentage points off South Korea's economic growth that year, South Korea has been hesitant to frame its long-standing alliance with the United States as anti-China, and Moon's administration has expressed skepticism toward talk of officially joining with the United States, Australia, Japan, and India, a gathering dubbed the Quad. A senior foreign ministry official said Seoul was open to working with the Quad as long as it was based on openness, transparency, and inclusiveness. We will have in-depth discussions with the United States based on those principles and make a decision according to our national interests, the official said. The Moon government made it publicly clear it will not participate in an initiative that excludes or contains a particular country, meaning China, said Dooyeon Kim, with the U.S.-based Center for a New American Security. Unless the allies get very creative with nuances, it will be difficult to impossible to get this particular progressive South Korean government to join such democratic coalitions, she said. Some South Korean officials think South Korea may have no choice but to sign on with Washington's campaign against China, and that it could serve Seoul's interests in the end, including on North Korea, said one diplomatic source familiar with their thinking. The Quad is indeed an effort to build a bulwark against China, and joining it would give Seoul more leverage in both driving Washington to restart talks with the North Koreans and dealing with Beijing, though it would risk causing some discomfort in China relations as an immediate impact, the source said. South Korea's desire to avoid antagonizing China while strengthening ties with the United States may be a useful reality check for American officials, Delury said. South Korea's desire to get along with both the U.S. and China is shared pretty widely across the region, he said. I'm not sure it's sustainable to push on a hawkish Indo-Pacific when that's not what the Indo-Pacific wants. Top U.S. Japan officials say China's behavior inconsistent with international order. Tokyo, senior officials from United States and Japan on Tuesday raised concerns about China's behavior in Hong Kong, Xinjiang and other areas and said it was inconsistent with the international order. A joint statement from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and their Japanese counterparts said they had serious concerns about recent disruptive developments in the region, such as the China Coast Guard law. They said they had discussed Washington's unwavering commitment to defend Japan in the East China Sea, and reiterated their opposition to China's unlawful maritime claims in South China Sea. China's foreign ministry said on Wednesday it has lodged stern representations with the United States and Japan over the statement and is strongly urging the two countries to stop interfering in its internal affairs. The U.S.-Japan joint statement is a malicious attack on China's foreign policy and grossly interferes in China's internal affairs in an attempt to harm China's interest. China deplores and rejects this, ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian told a regular news briefing. China lodges stern representations with U.S., Japan over joint statement. Beijing-China's foreign ministry on Wednesday said it has lodged stern representations with the United States and Japan over a statement from both countries' senior officials that raised concerns about Beijing's behavior in a range of areas. China is strongly urging the United States and Japan to stop interfering in China's internal affairs, the ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian told a regular news briefing. Bolstered by allies, Biden officials take blunt message to first China talks. Washington, Beijing. The United States will take an uncompromising stance in talks with China on Thursday in Alaska. Officials have said, in the first face-to-face meetings between senior officials from the two rivals since U.S. President Joe Biden took office. Beijing has called for a reset to ties, now at their lowest in decades, but Washington has said the Alaska talks will be a one-off, and any future engagement depends on China improving its behavior. We look forward to the opportunity to lay out in very clear terms to our Chinese counterparts some of the concerns that we have about the actions they're taking, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Wednesday in Tokyo. Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan will meet China's top diplomat Yang Jieqi and State Councilor Wang Yi in Alaska, fresh off of visits to allies. Japan and South Korea aimed at emphasizing the U.S. commitment to the Indo-Pacific in the face of Beijing's rise. In Tokyo on Tuesday, Blinken pledged to push back against Beijing's coercion and aggression, including its expansive territorial claims in the East and South China Seas. It was a measure of the bluntness that has come to mark the U.S. posture toward Beijing under Biden. As the world's two largest economies search for a semblance of stable ground on which to base ties, after they sank under former President Donald Trump. The Anchorage meeting, the first high-level face-to-face exchange since June when Blinken's predecessor, Mike Pompeo, held a frosty meeting with Yang in Hawaii, is likely to be short on diplomatic niceties or outcomes. Due to COVID restrictions, there are no plans for a shared meal, which had been a feature of recent exchanges. And there are indications that the two sides have divergent expectations. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian has referred to the talks as a high-level strategic dialogue. China hopes the meeting will help set a broad framework for resuming engagement, rather than resolve specific issues, a person in Beijing familiar with planning for the talks told Reuters. But Biden officials have been explicit that Alaska is not a return to regular dialogue, which under previous administrations did little to resolve Washington's concerns with Beijing. We expect that there are parts of the conversation that could be difficult, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki told reporters. A senior U.S. administration official said at a briefing that Washington would be looking at deeds, not words, if Beijing wanted to change the tone of the relationship. First round of a boxing match. On paper, at least, the context for bilateral relations has changed for Beijing since Trump, with his go it alone America First foreign policy. Biden has pledged to restore American alliances, and its partners appear ready to oblige. The United States, Japan, India, and Australia last week held a leaders' summit, pledging to cooperate on maritime, cyber, and economic security issues vital to the four democracies in the face of challenges from China. And the Biden administration has embarked on a Europe roadshow, what U.S. officials have been calling daily engagement with Europe on issues including China's rise. Evan Medeiros, an Asia specialist in the Obama administration who now teaches at Georgetown University, called the Alaska talks the first round of a boxing match that was unlikely to resolve any major issues, but could lower the chance of future miscalculations between the rivals. I think it's largely going to be an airing of grievances on both sides, Medeiros said. On U.S. soil, Sullivan told reporters last week he didn't expect Trump's Phase 1 trade deal, or details on tariffs or export controls, to be a major topic in Alaska, and noted many of the economic specialists needed to reach detailed agreements would be absent. Sullivan said the United States would use the meeting to convey to China its strategic intention and concerns with China's actions, including the rollback of democracy in Hong Kong. Human rights abuses in Xinjiang, strains across the Taiwan Strait, economic coercion over Australia, and harassment in waters disputed with Japan around the Senkaku Islands. Those are areas where Beijing says Washington shouldn't meddle. Biden officials have said it was important to them that their first high-level contact with China happened in the United States, with Alaska a symbolic reference to the country's enduring Pacific power. It will be the second consecutive time in less than a year that Yang has flown to U.S. soil. Despite this gesture, seen by Chinese observers as a sign of Beijing's goodwill, there appears little hope, on both sides, for breakthroughs. Even if there is some initial cooperation on concrete matters like climate change, the positive effect of that is insignificant in the face of relations marked by competition and confrontation on all fronts, Shi Yonhap, a professor at Renmin University in Beijing, told Reuters. Taiwan bolsters South China Sea deployments, gets U.S. submarine parts approval. Taipei, Taiwan's newly appointed defense minister said on Wednesday it has strengthened deployments in the disputed South China Sea, and that the United States has approved the export of sensitive technology to equip Taiwan's new submarine fleet. China, which claims democratic Taiwan as its own territory, has increased its military activity near the island in recent months, seeking to pressure Taipei to accept Beijing's sovereignty. Taiwan has vowed to defend itself. Speaking in Parliament, Defense Minister Chu Kuo-cheng, who took up his post last month, said Taiwan has increased personnel and armaments on Itu-Aba, the main island Taiwan occupies in the South China Sea. Itu-Aba, also known as Taiping Island, is the largest naturally occurring island in the Spratlys and is garrisoned by Taiwan's Coast Guard. They are capable of starting a war, Chu told the parliament when asked by a lawmaker on whether China could attack Taiwan. My goal is for us to be ready at all times. Chu said Taiwan was bolstering its position there due to China's expansionism in the region, though it was not currently considering a return to a permanent army garrison. China has built man-made islands in the South China Sea and air bases on some of them. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei all have competing claims in the strategic waterway. Separately, Chu said that the United States had approved export permits for all of the sensitive equipment needed by Taiwan's indigenous submarine fleet, which it started building last year. He added that Taiwan's arms purchases from the United States, the island's main source of weapons, had not been impacted by the new Biden administration taking office in Washington and were continuing. Taiwan is modernizing its armed forces, especially as it faces almost daily challenges from China in the airspace and waters near the island, including frequent Chinese Air Force missions into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone. Chu said these missions were part of China's war of attrition against Taiwan, whose forces are dwarfed by Beijing's, and defense forces were already adjusting on how to deal with such incursions, though did not give details. If we match them one for one, it costs a lot, he said. UK lawmakers call for blacklist of firms linked to Uyghur abuses. London, Britain should look to crack down on forced labor of Uyghurs in China's Xinjiang region with a blacklist of companies that cannot show clean supply chains and tough penalties for those which break anti-slavery law, lawmakers said on Wednesday. Some firms operate in willful blindness over labor abuse risks in their supply chains, while the government is failing to properly enforce human rights standards, said the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy (BEIS) Scrutiny Committee. Amid compelling evidence of abuses, there has been a sorry absence of significant new government measures to prohibit UK businesses from profiting from the forced labor of Uyghurs in Xinjiang and other parts of China, said committee member Nusrat Ghani in a statement. It is deeply concerning that companies selling to millions of British customers cannot guarantee that their supply chains are free from forced labor. The United Nations estimates at least 1 million Uyghurs and other minority Muslims are held in camps in China's far west region of Xinjiang. China has rejected accusations of persecution and forced labor of Uyghurs, saying the camps offer vocational training and help to fight terrorism and extremism. Zhang Ming, China's ambassador to the European Union, said on Tuesday that China haters were spreading lies for political gain. He warned against planned EU sanctions for human rights violations, saying Beijing would not yield if Brussels interfered in its internal affairs. Fashion brands are seen as particularly high risk for Uyghur labor abuses through their use of cotton. More than 80% of China's cotton comes from Xinjiang. While most brands say they do not have relationships with factories in Xinjiang, their supply chains are likely to be tainted by cotton picked by Uyghurs that is exported and used by other suppliers, anti-slavery activists have warned. Lawmakers said many brands reported robust procedures to prevent rights abuses but failed to carry out the necessary and basic due diligence to ensure their supply chains were not implicated in slave labor in a new report. Meanwhile, the government's 2015 Modern Slavery Act is now outdated and has no teeth to deal with rule breakers. It said, and the base business department shows little sign of leading investigations on British business links to forced labor. Companies operating in Xinjiang must prove that they are not in breach of the Modern Slavery Act, said the committee. It called on the government to report on the feasibility of publishing a whitelist of firms that had proved they were clean of abuses and a blacklist of those who failed to provide evidence or to answer questions. The government should also strengthen the supply chain transparency obligations for companies and introduce tough fines for non-compliance, it said. A spokesman for the government said it was taking forward plans to extend the Modern Slavery Act to cover some public bodies as well as large companies, and to introduce financial penalties for organizations that don't comply. Forced labor is one of the world's most despicable practices and the government will not stand for it, whether this exploitation takes place in the UK or abroad, he told the Thomson Reuters Foundation in a statement. Pfizer to halt biosimilar output in China, sell assets to Wuzhai Biologics. Beijing, Pfizer Incorporated will stop producing biosimilar products in China and sell a unit in the eastern city of Hangzhou to Wuzhai Biologics Incorporated, the U.S. drug maker said on Wednesday. The pharmaceutical industry increasingly relies on costly biologic drugs, made from living organisms that are tougher and more expensive to make than conventional medicines with chemical ingredients. The site was planned to manufacture 3 biosimilars for the China market, the company said in a response to Reuters' questions. Pfizer commercially and technically evaluated other products for the site but none reached the level of activity for the scale of the site. Neither Pfizer nor Wuzhai disclosed the deal value, or the products to be made after the transaction closes, which is expected in the first half of this year. Wuzhai said the deal would allow it to address surging manufacturing demand for drug substances and drug products. The facilities are equipped with bioreactors and capable of filing vials and syringes, the Chinese firm said in a statement on the WeChat app. Wuzhai also makes vaccine substances for a COVID-19 shot developed by AstraZeneca plc and the University of Oxford to supply Brazil. After the acquisition, the facility will focus on providing premier drug substance and drug product manufacturing services based on clients' demand for biologics including monoclonal antibodies, a Wuzhai Biologics representative said. The company declined to comment on whether the plant would turn out substances for COVID-19 vaccine. Russia says British nuclear plans deal serious blow to arms control, RIA. Moscow, Britain's plans to expand its nuclear capabilities have dealt a serious blow to the concept of arms control, the RIA news agency reported Russia's foreign ministry is saying on Wednesday. Moscow said will take London's move into account when working on its own military planning, RIA added. Britain will increase its nuclear warhead stockpile by more than 40% to ensure its security in a more risky global environment and as it faces new technological threats, Prime Minister Boris Johnson said on Tuesday. Don't forget to comment below with your common sense and subscribe to your podcast. This helps bring the podcast to life and grow it. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. We can't wait to continue this adventure with you. Support us on PayPal. Thank you very much and enjoy listening.